Good morning, everyone. My name is Khalil. I'm the head of the archives and special collections at the Jaffet Library. And in the name of the Issam Institute and the university libraries at EUB, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Salim Tamari, who will present a lecture entitled Photography as Propaganda, the war photography of Khalil Raad in the Palestine Sinai front during World War I. Professor Salim Tamari is professor of sociology at Birzeit University since 1971. He holds a PhD from Manchester University, 1983. He has held several academic appointments worldwide at leading academic institutions. The list goes on and on. He most recently was the Shawab visiting professor at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University in January 2013. He was a visiting professor at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul, summer 2012, a visiting professor at Columbia University at the Middle East Institute and the School of International and Public Affairs, 2011. He was an adjunct faculty at the Center for Arab Studies at Georgetown University in 2010. He held the Aga Khan Research Fellowship at MIT in 2009. He was the Eric Lind Fellow at Cambridge University 2008. He had academic appointments at the University of California, Berkeley 2005, 7, 8, at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari Center for Mediterranean Studies 2006 to the present, at NYU between 2001 and 2003, at Cornell in 1997, University of Paris at Jussieu 1993, University of Chicago 1991-92, University of Michigan 1987, Durham University, UK 1984, and I'm sure I'm leaving out a few. Dr. Tamari is the director of the Institute of Jerusalem Studies and the editor of Hawliyyat al-Quds and of the Jerusalem Quarterly. He is the author of several works on urban culture, political sociology, biography, and social history, as well as on the social history of the Eastern Mediterranean. Some of his recent publications include Jerusalem in 1948, Al-Quds al-Osmaniya, Mandate Jerusalem in the Memoirs of Wasif Jawahiri, Pilgrims, Lepers, and Stuffed Cabbage, Essays on the Cultural History of Ottoman and Mandate Jerusalem, Biography and Social History of Bilad al-Sham, Al-Jabal Qud al-Bahr, The Mountain Against the Sea, Al-Jarad, The Intimate Life of an Ottoman Soldier, Family Papers, Studies in the Contemporary Social History of Palestine, Year of the Holocaust, Palestine and Syria during World War I. His current research interests focus on Ottoman mapping and ethnicity, the planning of Jerusalem in the late Ottoman and Mandate periods, on communalism, orthodoxy, and Ottomanism. Dr. Tamari, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Dr. Shbak, for having me here. I want to thank the Faris Institute also for inviting me, and for Lara Azam and Hannah Sulaiman and their team for being kind, taking care of me while I was in Beirut. The subject of our discussion today, the photography of Khalil Raad, is a part of a retrospective of photography and ethnography on the occasion of the centenary of the Great War. And it's interesting that there's one Great War, but there are many horrendous wars that followed, but the Great War has been reserved for the First World War. And it's a rather contentious subject because there's a great deal of interpretation in what I'm going to say, and I'm sure some of you may want to contest this interpretation. It's not that I invented the events that I will talk about. It's just that the amount of material that surrounds the background of Khalil Raad's involvement with the Ottoman war machine and with the Ottoman state is not recorded. It arrived to us from a number of sources, some of which is fragmentary and some of it leads to a great deal of speculation. So what I'm saying basically is that I invite you to challenge and raise issues with what I'm going to say. One of the features of the Great War is that it brought a great amount of technology in monitoring, in surveying, and in creating a propaganda base for both the Allies and the Entente powers, which included Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman state. And there was a very heavy use of surprisingly modern technological systems, including cinematography, aerial photography, aerial surveillance, but also things like cinema, postcards, snapshots, and big posters. Quite a few of these have actually been retained, and we have them now as part of our archival collection. In the case of Palestine, the Ottomans utilized to a great extent a collaboration between the nascent Ottoman Air Force, which was based in a place called Ibn Air Force in Sinai and in Beersheba, together with the Bavarian Air Force, with the German Air Force, to survey and, of course, use combat units. I don't know if the word combat units can be used for these very tiny, small airplanes to bombard enemy installations on the Sinai front. But for our purposes, what's important here is that the Ottomans were able to mobilize a great deal of talents who were very good in doing surveys and photographic imaging on their behalf. And that period, of course, is signified by the beginning of the use of color photography. Albert Kahn, based in Paris, a very well-known banker, was very interested in photography. He sent teams of color photographers and cinematographers to do a survey of the Ottoman Levant on the eve of the war. And many of their products now are available in the Albert Kahn Museum in Paris. Unfortunately, they are not digitized online. They're digitized, but not digitized online. So you have to go to Paris to see them. They also collaborated with the Lumiere brothers, who took a lot of interesting shots from that area, the aim of which was to shoot the Levant on the eve of modernity. On their part, the Ottomans were able to mobilize the support of very important writers and photographers. Those included Sven Hansen, who was a Norwegian. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Sven Hansen, Theodor Weigert, who was a German ethnographer and you say museumologist, the person who does museums. And also photographers like Louis Larson, who was the head of the photography department in the American colony in Jerusalem. And of course, Arab native photographers like the Albina brothers and our man, Khalil Raad. Now, these people were not necessarily pro-Ottoman, but they were involved to various degrees with the state of the Ottoman war effort. Some of them were hardcore believers, like Sven Hansen, who thought that the Ottomans were modernizing the Middle East and they were facing the imperial challenges of the West. Although he himself was a Norwegian Germanophile, Weigert, who also believed in the heritage building capacities of the Ottoman state, and Khalil Raad, who for a number of reasons became totally immersed and involved with the war effort. He was given access to installations, front arenas, and areas of combat with the British. it also involved cinematographic material. We have this very unique shot of the, this is the launch boat, part of the Ottoman fleet in the Dead Sea, believe it or not. I don't know if you've been to the Dead Sea, but it's hard to imagine an Ottoman fleet in the Dead Sea. The purpose of this fleet was to bring grains from Transjordan to the West Bank. That is the West Bank of the Dead Sea, not of the Palestine. And this is the Notre Dame building showing, this picture was taken by Raad himself, showing Roshan Bek, who was the Albanian commander of the Jerusalem garrison, preparing the boat to be carried on wheels, driven by animals to the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. The beginning of the career of our man, Khalil Raad, was a collaboration with probably the most important pioneer of photography in the Holy Land. And as some of you know, photography, the native photographers in the East, all the way from Istanbul to Rafah, were Armenians. Armenians, partly because the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem had a photography training department, and Garabed Krikorian was a leading pioneer of that department. So Raad began his career as an intern and then later partner of Garabed Krikorian. And although they became competitors, they were later reconciled when Raad's niece Najla married the son of Garabed Krikorian. Raad is an outstanding example of Arab photography. I wrote here Palestinian, but I should warn you that he is actually Lebanese. And although he made his mark in Palestine, he comes from a Beiruti origins. And he later went back and died in Lebanon in the 1950s. So he started his career with Krikorian, taking photographs of biblical motifs to cater to pilgrims and tourists coming to the Holy Land. He later was commissioned, he reinvented himself in 1915 when he was commissioned to do war photography for the 4th Army under the command of Jamal Pasha. In the earlier period, he internalized what I call the biblical gaze. He became totally involved with taking pictures of peasants, Bedouins, pastoral scenes, reconstructing the Holy Land as the arena of desire for the tourists and pilgrims. And these were done on posters, on magic lantern slides, which were projected for pedagogical reasons, and especially postcards. Much of Raad's photographs of the pastoral scenery in the Holy Land, peasants in harvest time, the Holy Family en route to Egypt, were posed to conform to Orientalist notions of what the East looks like. But we should also say that they actually, despite their framing, they preserved a very rich ethnographic material on actual conditions that were taking place. I mean, it's true that sometimes they dressed peasant women to look like the Virgin Mary standing next to Joseph, and the baby Jesus was a bit of a problem because most of the peasant children were very messy and dirty, but they had to prepare them for the occasion. And yet, these were highly realistic pictures of actual peasant cycles. So from an ethnographic point of view, it's extremely valuable material. Oops. Raad soon became very well known for his portraiture. And he began to take portraits of family weddings, baptismals, and increasingly pictures of young men going to war. They wanted to leave moment, because many of these young men never came back. So they needed to have mementos of their faces in uniform or without uniform to leave with their betrothed, with their families before they left. This is a very iconic image taken by Khalil Raad in 1906 of Khalil Sakakini on his way to America. And he especially took this picture to leave it with his fiancée, Sultana Abdu. And this is, not all of Raad's pictures were signed, but this picture is signed by Khalil Raad. And this is very common of taking pictures of soldiers in uniform. This is Hassan Shukri and Hussein Fakhri Khaldi, who were two medical officers. They actually studied at AUB, and the Ottoman command took them just before they finished their medical degree. So their family was very weary of going to be treated by them. Is there any Khalidi here in this room? Anyway, they used to warn people not to go to be treated by their Khalid because they did not finish their degree at AUB. So they were sent to Gallipoli, and Hassan Shukri became the inspector of health in Palestine after the war. And Hussein Fakhri on the right became the mayor of Jerusalem. He's a very famous man. Raad's partnership with Krikorian involved a division of labor, so that Krikorian continued to focus on portraiture and family gatherings, while Raad began to take street scenes. I mean, he must have been inclined to go out and do action photography, if that's the term, public ceremonies. And he began to take controversial pictures like this one of soldiers being hanged either because they're deserters or because they were accused of being in touch with the enemy. Now, you're familiar with this genre because this was before the famous hangings in Burj Square, in Sahat al-Shuhada in Beirut, and then later in Damascus. But it started in Jerusalem, actually, hanging deserters. During the war, Raad became close to Jamal. According to Raad's daughter, what's her name, Alex? Ruth. Ruth Raad says that Raad was close to Jamal Pasha, and he commissioned him to do war photography, as he did with Sven Hansen, Weigert, and others. And we know that Jamal himself, who of course was known as Fafah, had a soft spot for the American colony, where Raad worked for a period. And we have images of Jamal playing with little children. I mean, looks like a family scene while he was in the war effort. We don't know if Raad took this picture. This is a very famous picture of Jamal, because one of the few pictures showing him relaxed in a family setting. But nevertheless, he became involved in the war effort, and he was given access to military installations, to signaling posts, and to combat units, mostly in Sinai and in the southern front in Birzeit. He also began to take a series of portraits of military commanders, Austrian, Germans, and Ottomans. This is, does anybody know who this is? This is Jamal Pasha, but not the big Jamal. This is the little Jamal, Jamal Kuchuk. And he was the good Jamal, because Ahmed Jamal was the Safah, and Muhammad Jamal was the leader of the Fifth Army, who tried to fix and ameliorate the bad reputation of Ahmed Jamal after 1917. And we have a number of photographs which appear in high-resolution Library of Congress caches of this Jamal, signed by Khalil Raad. And again, this is one of the few military pictures actually signed by by Khalil Raad. This is von Christenstein, and on the right is the famous Ali Roshenbeek, the head of the Jerusalem garrison. He was the commander of the Jerusalem forces, and his deputy was an Armenian general called Bogosyan. And he's one of the few Armenians who remained fighting with the Ottomans, and he withdrew with the Turkish army in December of 1917 to Aleppo. So Ali Roshenbeek had a very favorable reputation as somebody who took care of his soldiers during the war. And you can see it, there's a number of shots of him by Raad. Now, these series of photographs raise issue of what was Khalil Raad's motivations in this. Was he just a mercenary? Was he taking photographs for money? Or did he actually believe in the Ottoman war effort? And I will return back at the end of this presentation to discuss this issue. Because there's a big debate about what motivated Raad to become so involved with the Ottoman war effort. And of course, we are saturated in Greater Syria, here in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in Palestine, with Arab nationalist historiography, which portrays the Ottomans and the Turks as the big bad wolf. But in retrospect, now we are beginning to reconstruct that event in a more balanced way to see why were so many people involved on the Ottoman side in publicity, in ethnography, in taking pictures, and so on. Despite this, we know from Raad's photograph that he showed the bad side of war. I showed you a picture of the hanging, and we also have a series of pictures of the volunteer labor battalions. They're called the Tawabir Amali in Turkish and Tawabir Shagil in Arabic. These were forced labor battalions where mostly Jews and Christians were sent to work with them because they were not trusted with the fighting in the front, but also many Muslims who were above work age were sent to them. And Raad took a number of these pictures of the labor brigades. This is one showing labor brigades digging trenches in the Beirut area. Now, we have a very interesting collection called the Saunders Collection, which was deposited in St. Anthony's College in Oxford by a military officer who worked with the mandate. And he said that these photographs were seized from the studios of Raad. He was actually arrested for being collaborator with the Ottomans. And they took these photographs as evidence of his collaborative schemes. Now, it's a very interesting collection, and they all show a substantial involvement of Raad with underground production centers and war installations during the war. And these are made into 40 postcards. In St. Anthony, you can only find the postcards, but the originals, I found about 50% of those in the American Colony Collection in the Library of Congress. So they are available in higher resolution, but they show variably, like this one shows a printing press called Shoal, which means desert in English, and it was a printing press for the armed forces in Beirut. This shows the launching of the fleet in the Dead Sea, which I spoke about. This is the imperial lances of the 4th Army who were guarding Jamal Pasha. This signaling post in Nabi Samuel near Jerusalem. Shoe factory in Nablus. Again, the production of the newspaper, feeding the armed forces. Some of them are very interesting because it shows The Ottomans were very keen at showing that the Ottoman army was an army of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And this is a funeral for a Christian officer who died near Beersheba, again taken by Khalil Raad. Again, another picture from Nablus, so people doing army uniforms. And again, I show you the picture to show you that Raad actually was involved in showing the harsher side of life. Of course, as Alex Baramki reminds me, the taking of the picture is not necessarily showing Raad's identification with the soldier, because sometimes the Ottomans wanted to have preemptive photographs. They wanted, because this is widely distributed, warning people that if you collaborate with the British or the French, this is your fate. And they had a sign on their chest showing what happens to people who collaborate. Now we see a very interesting transition, because Raad lived for 103 years, and he kept taking photographs. He did not stop. I think he was taking photographs while he was asleep as well, because we have thousands and thousands and thousands of his pictures. And he kept taking pictures during the mandate, and we see a slight difference in the perspective, because even though he took pictures of commanders in the British Army, as he did with the Ottomans, he soon began to show clashes between the national movement and the Palestinian national movement and the British Army, especially over the issue of the Balfour Declaration and military orders imposed by the British, which shows a different angle than the one he had during the Ottoman period. He showed, for example, how the British imposed uniformed soldiers at the entrance of holy places. One interesting feature which comes out in Raad's photography is how the British sequestered the holy city so that it became a completely sectarian city, where Christians only were allowed to the Christian holy places, Jews only were allowed to Jewish holy places, and only Muslims can go to Al-Aqsa. Whereas in the Ottoman period, Al-Aqsa was actually a major park. Well, park is not the right word, but it's a sort of a breathing space for all of Jerusalem inhabitants. And the British brought in the Indian soldiers, who were Muslims, of course, to make sure that people go to where they belong. And of course, this was reflected in identity cards where you had to declare your religion. The old city became divided into 4 quarters. This is a British invention. The Armenian, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. The old city was never divided into such 4 quarters. The ethnic religious groups were embedded throughout the city. So under the British, it became a divided city. And this you can see in the photography of Raad. Raad also captured a lost world, the world of dominated by rural ethnography, where you can see the magic lanterns and the magic boxes. This is called Sanduq al-Ajab. I mean, some of you who are over 60 may remember what Sanduq al-Ajab is. Or if you are a sociologist, like Sari Hanafi, you would know what Sanduq al-Ajab. But this is the story of Abu Zayd al-Hilali, which was put on a wheel, and I was about 8 or 9 the last time I saw one, and we used to pay the performer with a piece of bread or 2 eggs, because they would not take money. And I mean, they would take money, but we didn't have money to give them. So we would give them a bit of food, and they would narrate the adventures of Abu Zayd al-Hilali, Al-Flayl al-Layli, on a revolving wheel. So the question is, was Raad a mercenary? I think Raad definitely was involved with the Ottomans, partly out of pecuniary considerations. He was paid for his work, but he actually believed that he was defending the Ottoman realm from colonial Western intrusions. And this can be speculated from the degree of intimacy in which he was involved with the subjects he was taking. An intimacy which was transformed later during the British period with a certain degree of objectification and even, one could say, a degree of hostility towards the imperial forces trying to crush the Arab rebellion in 1929, 36, and clashes between Arab demonstrators and the British military. Raad died in exile in Beirut, 1957, at the age of 103 years. He was buried in the Rome Orthodox Cemetery, and during his life he witnessed 5 regimes: the Hamidian Sultanate, the Constitutional Ottoman State, the British Mandate of Palestine, Jordanian rule of the West Bank, as well as Israeli conquest of Palestine in 1948. During the war, he lost his home, his photographic collection, which was in West Jerusalem, and his caches of photographs were pillaged twice. First in 1917 by the British forces, and luckily for us, they ended up in St. Anthony's College, part of it, and the rest was salvaged by his family. And we today are very happy to own this important, not all of it, but a great deal of it is on glass negatives in the Institute for Palestine Studies in Verdun. And that's it. Thank you.
When you say they were circulated, how were the images circulated?
Sorry?
How were the images circulated? How were they distributed? In newspapers during the war, when they were used for?
Can you remove because I can't hear it from me.
How were the images circulated? The propagandistic.
How were they circulated? Yes.
And then the other question is, do we know of him ever working outside of Palestine? Like later on in his life, when he was in did he take photographs there?
Yes. The images were circulated. Cinematic images were actually shown in local cinemas in Jaffa and Jerusalem. And they also had military showings in camps. Most of the images which were used as propaganda were circulated as postcards, very exceptionally as posters. We have very few posters from that period on the Ottoman side. On the German, French, and even American side, you have a lot of, and Russians, of course. Russians were pioneers in poster art in that period. But very few we have Red Crescent posters. So mostly postcards. And the earlier pictures were circulated as magic lantern slides. And they were sold, they were more expensive, they were sold as slides. And many of the tourists bought them to project, to show that they were in the Holy Land. And these were used as stereoscopic images. I mean, the pictures were taken at slightly different angles, and when you project, it becomes 3D. And not on the wall, of course. You project it in a stereoscopic reader. I don't know, do you know these machines? You're familiar with them. So that's the main way. pictures were also circulated by family members and what's interesting is that the resolution is fantastic. I mean, much better pictures were taken at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, than in the 1930s and 40s. And I don't understand this. I mean, when they were glass negatives, they had much better resolution than they did in the 20s and 30s, at least in the most available cameras. The other question was, did you do anything outside Palestine? Very little. We have archaeological tourist pictures taken in Baalbek by Raad, and I believe some in Beirut. It's interesting, Beirut was his town, but almost nothing about Lebanon in his work. So, and the Palestinians claim him as their own, although he was a Lebanese man. I mean, he was Lebanese by blood. But of course, we're talking about a period when Lebanon and Palestine were one country. I mean, we were part of Wilayat Beirut, was part of the same Wilayah.
But wasn't Jamal based in Damascus, but photographed him in Jerusalem?
Who was based in Damascus?
The other Jamal.
The other Jamal? Both Jamals had headquarters in Damascus. Later in the war, the headquarters of Hamad Jamal was in Salt, in East Transjordan. But both had headquarters in Damascus, and then they moved to Augusta Victoria building, which was the military command of the Ottoman forces in Palestine. And they had the third headquarters in Birzeit, which was the frontline town facing the operations.
Thank you, Salim. Very good. But I have a little bit of problem the way you convey the word propaganda. I mean, I think you did really show us where is the propaganda, because the image by itself, in my sense, it's never propaganda unless it's falsified. If it is not falsified, it's not propaganda. But how it has been used or with other images can be propaganda or not. So
what's the word you use? Until it is what?
No. I
propaganda.
If you like, if tomorrow I am a photographer and I show the hanging of a Lebanese soldier by Daesh, by itself, I'm not doing war propaganda. Now, if we look how it is publicized, the social media, etc., we can say there is a war propaganda using such images.
Yes,
but I mean, this is the argumentation you did today. It's not. I think it's not sufficient.
No, that's a good point you're raising. I use the term propaganda to mean images which were meant to mobilize, incite, and preempt. So they had political objectives. Now, sometimes they boomerang. They did not have the intended consequence of what they were made for. For example, you show the picture of a hanged soldier to preempt others, to warn others not to become collaborators or presumed collaborators. I don't know how truthful this was. But what happens instead, as with Daesh and the chopping of the heads, it produces the opposite effect. So the fact that it had no consequence for the intended propaganda does not make it less of a propaganda, if you know what I mean. The intent was to circulate images in order to mobilize. And they did this through postcards, through images in papers, with captions and so on. Now, in the word propaganda, of course, evolved later with negative connotation, meaning that it's false construction of images. But this is not necessarily the case. One feature of Ottoman propaganda, in terms of the many pictures I showed of underground production centers, was to show the modernity of the Ottoman army. So they're not meant to actually mobilize on behalf of the Ottomans. They were meant to show that we are as good as you are. We have our air force, we have our machinery, we have anti-aircraft guns. It did not always work, but we have them, and so on. And we have big tailoring enterprises. And one area where this propaganda actually was very effective is in the compendium written by Muhammad Kurd Ali called Al-Ba'tha al-Ilmiya Lidar al-Khilaf al-Islamiyya, which is full of these photographs. And was published in Beirut, actually, in 1916, which is an expedition to Gallipoli made by the Ottoman army. And they used these images as propaganda with one purpose. Well, with two purposes, I suppose. But the main purpose was to show that we are modern. We are as good as the English and the French. We have all the paraphernalia, and some of it, of course, was borrowed from the Germans, but still we have it. And here it is. So you're right. I mean, the word propaganda is very problematic in this sense, but that was the intent.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm wondering, in light of what happened to the Armenians almost exactly 100 years ago, whether Raad was familiar with that, and given his loyalty to the Ottoman regime, and at the same time his close friendship with people like Krikorian, if that created any kind of cognitive dissonance in his thinking. Did you discover anything in your research about his response to that historical?
That's a very good question. Raad was very close to the Armenians, both in terms of internship, partnership, and marriage, because his nephew, his niece, was married to Krikorian's son. And he must have been aware of the fate of the Armenians, because Jerusalem, like Damascus, Aleppo, Beirut, received tens of thousands of Armenian refugees. We have no evidence of this sympathy, although it's unavoidable that he had it. And I must say that in Jerusalem, although there was sympathy for the Armenians, was not always translated against the war effort itself. It was translated against the Young Turk leadership, which perpetrated these, including Jamal Pasha himself. But that initially, at least 1915-16 period, at the height of the pogroms of the Armenians, did not translate itself in desertion, for example, from the army. And we have no written records left by Raad except the captions on the photographs. The captions of the photographs include a large number of Armenians being photographed from the Patriarchate, street scenes, and so on. So he must have been aware of the Armenian condition, but I don't know what his personal reactions were to it.
I was struck by two points that you highlighted in your presentation regarding the subject presented by Raad. The biblical gaze on one hand and the propaganda, realistic, almost journalistic.
Both were propaganda, actually.
Both are constructed in a way.
Yeah.
But I was wondering whether in your research you came across any documents or information at the level of the technique he used to convey these two constructed images, one kind of backward looking or looking towards the past as a constructed object, and one looking towards modernity and technology, war, etc. At the level of technique, but also at the level of his intellectual formation maybe, or the cultural level, in terms of the two threads. How do these two poles get enacted at the level of photography?
Yes. The short answer to this is I don't know. But I know he was trained by Garabedian in quite advanced systems of portraiture, of doing magic lantern slides, 3D issues. I mean, these were like cutting edge technologies, using the best cameras, the best film, the best development procedure that existed in Europe at the same time. And remember, they started taking photographs in the 1850s, and photography was invented just 5 years earlier. So we're talking about, I mean, even today, you can't hard to imagine the speed by which these techniques evolved. Now, in terms, I can say something about the other technology, which is the biblical gaze. He was involved through Garabedian, Krekorian, and the American colony team in creating the scenes for the biblical gaze, namely to dress people in certain ways so they look biblical. The Virgin Mary, Joseph, the nativity scene that came to Egypt, they actually intervened in the peasant landscape to recreate. Now, one feature of it is that many people thought that Palestinian peasants did not change, that this is the way Jesus Christ lived. This is part of the Orientalist gaze, is that this is exactly what Jesus looked like. And there's a famous film by Pasolini. I don't know, did you see that film, Pasolini in the Holy Land? Where he goes to film the gospel according to St. Matthew. And he keeps moving from Jerusalem to Jifna to Bethlehem. And then we see him on the thing saying, but this is not the way the Bible looked like. And you would think he was thinking of modernity as the fact. But actually he decided that the people looked too Arab to be biblical, because in his mind he was mesmerized by probably Renaissance paintings. I mean, they were too Arab for the biblical. So he went to where? He went to Sicily. Where they still look Arab, but not as much Arab as they were in the Holy Land. And then he shot the film in Sicily, as far as I know. Maybe partly in Morocco, but mostly in Sicily. So it's interesting that Khalil Raad became part of this process of converting the Holy Land into a set for the biblical gaze. And he did this in the same manner that Larson and Matson and others, and Bonfils before them here in Beirut did it. But as far as technology, I don't really, I cannot answer your question. I don't know enough about it.
So at the level of culture, popular culture, say, how do these two poles relate in terms of construction?
Say that again.
At the level of pop culture, say, the pop cultural elements,
yes.
Do we see common threads between these two poles? I mean, both are constructed images. One, wanting to project an image of force, of forward-looking, of planning, of
yes.
brutality, violence, and the other kind of a veiled object of desire that can be uncovered, etc.
Yes, there is a big rupture, because if you're talking about the military installations, the military shots, and the biblical scenes, there's a major rupture, which actually did not happen suddenly, because it was intervened through actual ethnographic material of family settings, baptismals, weddings. He did a lot of portraitures, huge number of portraits. And now, even I go to private homes and ask people about old photographs. I see a lot of Raad. Every week I discover new Raad pictures which have not been seen, because people inherited them. He must have been a factory. I mean, every day he went to weddings and baptismals, and shot people. So between the biblical gaze and the Ottoman military installations, there was a social life of the street and of the house. And so not all his pictures were framed by either a propagandistic political agenda or an ethnographic biblical agenda, because he was part of the people. He actually shot scenes of daily life. And then later in the British Mandate, he shot street scenes of clashes, demonstrators, rebellion, shooting, and so on. So basically what we see in Raad is a reinvention of himself. And they're like highly compartmentalized parts. And later he never went back to the biblical scene. He became a portrait and street photographer. So he did it commercially at one period in his life, and then he moved on. And any serious writings on Raad would have to see how he evolved as a photographer. And 100 years is a long time for somebody. I mean, of the 103 years he lived, he was taking photographs for 80 years. So you can imagine the repertoire and the extent of his production. I should add that Alex Baramki, sitting in the back, disagrees with everything I said. So if he wants to say something, because you keep shaking your head all the time.
Hello. I've always wondered why Armenians were very prominent photographers in Jerusalem. Maybe you can.
Armenians?
Yes.
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. Why Armenians?
I interviewed Hashim al-Madani, a photographer based in Saido,
Yeah.
who in the 40s or 50s went to Palestine to study photography. He took the train at the time. And I mean, it's much later on, but he told me that there were a lot of Armenians that were prominent photographers. And I think early on in your talk, you mentioned that the Patriarch had a photography school.
Yes, yes. I think that is the answer to your question. The Armenians, it must be an accident of history. I don't think it's something to do with Armenian blood. The Patriarch in Jerusalem, who was not a protege. What's the opposite of protege? He was the patron of Garavet Krikorian. He started the photography school. He himself was a photographer. God knows where he got the technique, but he invested patriarchate money in photography. And it must be due to him that Armenians became involved. Now, it's true in Abdullah Freire, for example, in Istanbul, were Armenians. And they were the royal sultanic photographers for Abdul Hamid. So through them, it's possible that in the Ottoman regime, the Armenians, and they were pioneers way beyond. I mean, there was, of course, Marcel Duchamp with Flaubert, who came in the 1840s. So there were European people. Some were sent by Albert Kahn, and there were Bonfils, of course, in Beirut. He was not Armenian. But the Armenians were the pioneers as native photographers. And it's interesting that there were no Jews. I mean, there were Jewish photographers, but they came later on. So the Jews, the Arabs, like Sawabini and Saba and Abdo and Khalil Raad, came before the Jews. And it's only until the 1920s and 30s that you begin to see Jewish photographers in Jaffa and Jerusalem. But the Armenians were first, then the Arabs, then the Jews came. And at least it's one area where we were ahead of the Jews in this art.
I heard once a theory about this, saying that it could have something to do with the fact that many Armenians were jewelers and they needed the silver to
Silver nitrates, yes. Silver nitrate was essential for, that's a very good thought, actually. You need the silver nitrate. Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question. During the time that he was working, there was a great interest in Orientalism from the West. There was a great interest in Orientalism from the point of view of Europe and the West, capturing this biblical gaze in art. And I'm wondering if he had any association with any of the major painters of the period that he was perhaps photographing for some of them, so they could use the subjects as subjects to do the great paintings of the Orientalist school.
Which people do you have in mind?
Mainly the French.
Yes.
Jerome, and even some of the English, David, people like that who were doing these sketches. And
It's quite possible. It's interesting that the great French photographers who came to the Middle East did not leave any record of contacts with native photographers. And it's very curious. It's possible that they did not disclose it, but Duchamp, for example, Albert Kahn team produced enormously impressive photography. I mean, some of the earliest photographs of bordellos in the Middle East were taken by the Albert Kahn group, and they're magnificent photographs. In Jaffa, in Aleppo, in Istanbul, a lot of it in Beirut. Beirut seemed to have been the bordello capital of the Middle East. And a lot of it comes, I mean, these people were hesitant to take such photographs, but the French, of course, was part of the exotic East for them. But there is no synergy between these photographers and people like Raad. I mean, maybe Bonfils was a link, I don't know. It's something to consider. Mr. Baramki, do you want to say something? Yeah.
In defense.
I mean, but Alex, I should say, made me rethink many of the things I have done about Raad.
You're too kind, Salim, and after working with you and for you, I still learned a lot today from your presentation, so thank you. Two quick points. One on the subject of the Armenians as photographers. It seemed to me a gratitude that displaced people who therefore do not own land in the country they live in and do not have hereditary professions to inherit from their forefathers go into technical jobs and crafts involving skills you can carry with you, like photography, like jewelry making, like medical professions, and many Armenians were cobblers and shoemakers as well. Everything technical and a craft you could take with you because you did not have land to live off or a family business to inherit. I don't know how valid this point is. But another point I wanted to ask about is Raad's transition from the Ottoman Empire to the British Empire. And to make the point first that the British probably, for propaganda purposes, such as the Ottoman, and would have their own photographers, they weren't likely to trust a native local in the occupied country. So he really might not have had the choice to do portraits or official public events, but had to do the music things such as the uprising demonstrations. And on this, I read in the article by, I think someone called Haj, which you published, the Jerusalem Court, that he himself, you said his photographic collection was pillaged. He himself gave it to someone called Blight, and that collection ended up in Oxford. Do we know anything more about this? Because the article is a little dated.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important correction. You're suggesting that it went not through military appropriation, but that he voluntarily gave this light. It's possible. But the other point you made is actually more important, that the British had their own photographers, and therefore they did not need the native photographers. They did, and the British produced a large number of propaganda postcards in 1918, 1919, which are available, which showed the progress made in the Holy Land under British command. The Australians went one step further. Not only they had their photographers, but they had their own painters. And we have a series of magnificent oil and watercolors done by the Australian Army, some from the air. I mean, we have watercolor paintings made. The Australian Air Force had painters inside embedded in the airplane taking sketches of the scenery from the sky. And I showed you one of them here. Maybe they painted it later. I can't imagine them painting it then. But you're right. I mean, this is a major difference. This is one of the paintings made by the Australian Air Force of fighting in Wadi Farah near Jericho. There's about 22 of those, and they're beautiful, beautiful pictures. They are in something called the Australian World War I Memorial something. I mean, if you do Australia, Palestine war paintings, you will get these, and you can download them. And I'm now negotiating with the Australians to bring the original paintings because now we're commemorating the First World War. So we're trying to get the actual originals on display.
You also have I can't remember the painter, but each other has them in his private collection of the coast of the British Navy too, off Sarafan and Saida. I can't remember the painter.
Paintings
Yeah.
of Sarafan?
Off the coast of Sarafan and Saida, where you have the British naval fleet coming in.
Yeah.
And Philippe actually, Gabby Dyer does all his collection. He has amazing photographs too. And he just purchased one in his private collection.
Who is the person?
Philippe Jabber, but Gabby Dyer buys all his collections for him too.
So these are photographic
Photographs,
images.
and he's hoping to create a museum here and all of these on display. So he has.
Yeah.
quite a bit.
One great thing about this is that you bring out caches and inventories which we never knew about from the First World War. People still have all their family collections that will enrich this, and we'll throw light on these photographers that we don't know. I mean, Raad is notorious for not leaving any written records, so that restricts our ability to interpret his stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you.